Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great afternoon on this Wednesday. And I'm calling in from Madison, Wisconsin, where the fall weather is spectacular. And hopefully you're enjoying similar spectacular weather. And so Professor Pigeon and I have been interested or are very interested in the issue of ag data. And as you can see from our title, we talk both about the opportunities and the risks. And I'm going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes. Marc-André is going to talk for about 15, 20 minutes, and that should leave plenty of time for questions from all of you. And we hope we can have a robust discussion as much as possible towards the end of the presentation. And I am an attorney, and attorneys tend to talk fast. And so I will try to slow it down because besides the fact I've had a little caffeine this afternoon too, but to us, this is a really interesting issue for a variety of reasons. And just to put a little bit of color on it, and I'll be talking about this once I start going through the slides, but this is a really rapidly developing issue that's really developed over the last 5 to 6 years, if not a decade. And it's an issue that many people are not thinking about. In Marc-André's, in my opinion, more people should be thinking about this issue. And to the extent that people in agriculture, farmers, ranchers, ag business leaders, food processors are thinking about this, they're really thinking about it in terms of their own data. And they're not really thinking about it much in terms of the aggregation of data and where the value is in that and who's actually capturing the value and what opportunities and benefits that might lead to for the producer, because our focus has really been on the producer side. And so just to, next slide, please, Marc-André. So as we've gone forward on this issue, we decided to go to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and seek some funding to essentially explore this area, see what type of research has been done in Canada and then in North America and then indeed worldwide, and then look at what research really needs to be done in this area. And just to put a quick statement on the research, there hasn't been a lot done on this, in part because it is such a new issue. And once again, I'll be describing why it's a new issue here in the moment. And by using the word issue, I don't mean to put a negative cast on this at all. That's lawyer speak for when we identify something we're talking about, that's always an issue. So I just want to point that out up front. But as you can see from the slide, there's 4 of us at the University of Saskatchewan and the Johnson-Shoyoma Graduate School of Public Policy who decided we would take a closer look at this issue. And Professor Fulton, who until recently was the director of the school. Many of you know him or know of him at least because he has a deep background in cooperative research. And he's joined by Professor Pigeon, Marc-André, who is with us today, who comes in part out of the credit union sector, but has taken on this role as the director for the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives. My role is as a PhD student, a little bit older than probably what PhD students typically are, but I got enticed to do my PhD research at the University of Saskatchewan. Been there just over a year and I have not been disappointed. And then finally, Assistant Professor Yang is also participating in the research. So the 4 of us really over about the last 8 months did a survey of the research that's been done around the world. And we'll be reporting on some of that survey or the research results here in the upcoming slides. But as a second part of this, and I think Michelle might talk about this towards the end, we had applied for a grant from SHRC or SSHRC, and we were awarded that grant. And so we'll be having a conference in Kamloops, British Columbia in February, and be co-sponsored with BC Co-ops. And I need to say thank you, BC Co-ops, for sponsoring this today and inviting me to participate in this session. And we'll have more details for everyone on the BC conference coming up again next February. So let's get into the slides. So just for many of you are involved in Canadian agriculture, but it's always good just to go back out to the 35,000 foot level and say that agriculture is really, really important to Canada. And even though I'm based in the United States, I've always been aware of that because I grew up on a farm not far from Fargo, North Dakota. And as I've explained in presentations around the United States, we regard Canadians as first cousins. We regard anybody below Missouri as fourth cousins. And so we've always felt much closer to our Canadian cousins than our Southern cousins. And I know this is being recorded. This will probably come back to haunt me someday for that. But it really is true. There's a lot of commercial ties back and forth across the border. And one of those main commercial ties is agriculture. And really, the agriculture in North Dakota doesn't look a whole lot different than the agriculture in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and the southern part of Alberta. And then the agriculture in Wisconsin, because we have a lot of fruits, looks a lot like some of BC agriculture. And I know Warren's on from BC Tree Fruits. And so we have a lot of similarities between the provinces and the states. But again, taking this high view look in Canada, you've got 194,432 farms. This was as of 2018, about 64 million hectares of land. And those of us who pay attention to global climate change, regardless of what your view is on who's causing it to happen, that number of hectares of land is likely to increase in Canada. So it's not something where it's a diminishing industry, it's definitely a growing industry. And right now it's about 7% of Canada's land mass, but again, that's likely to grow. About $143 billion in gross domestic product, which is a significant contribution to the economic well-being of Canada, because that's 7.4% of Canada's gross domestic product. And it's 17% when you're looking at manufacturing and employment. And so it plays even a larger role when you consider that subsector of the Canadian economy. So agriculture generally is very, very important to Canada. So as a result, we argue this issue should be very, very important to Canada. And I think that's in part why we've been successful in getting the SSHRC or SHRC funding. So let's talk on the next slide about smart agriculture. And when I think about the type of agriculture I was involved in 10 years ago, we were just starting to think about smart devices. And what do I mean by smart devices? It's a device that's put in various types of agricultural implements, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, but it allows for data to be collected in a way that's never been collected before. Because in the past, it was always humans who had to collect this data. And now it's smart devices collecting this data. And there are a lot of advantages from the fact that it's smart devices rather than humans. And I keep foreshadowing here, but I'll be talking more about that as well in a moment. But there are a lot of promises from smart devices and in its use in agriculture. And many of those are being borne out. So they're not just promises, they're reality. And one is greater agricultural productivity, because a smart device in a planter can determine what's the most advantageous place for that seed to be placed. And in our non-smart equipment, in the past, seeds would be placed, and I've done this many, many times, would be placed in a certain distance from each other down a row in a field, regardless of what the soil conditions might be like. And what a smart device does is it gathers information, and I won't go through all this process now, but it gathers information in such a way that it really tells us in the end what's the best place to put the seed, and in some cases when's the best place to put the seed. And so from that alone is a significant efficiency increase. And I happen to be particularly knowledgeable about the dairy industry because I do live in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, the dairy industry is what we call the 800-pound gorilla. It's by far the largest sector of agriculture. It's about a $44 billion industry. That's in US dollars for the state of Wisconsin. And any of you who've seen either Wisconsin license plates or been to the state of Wisconsin, you know our license plates say America's Dairyland. And so how smart devices help there is farmers, because of labor shortages, are turning to robotic milkers. And robotic milkers are these machines that milk cows with very, very little human interaction. And so it allows the cow to be milked at the best time. And it also makes sure that if a cow decides, because in many cases the cows get some feed, after they've milked. It prevents the cow from coming back for second and thirds before they should be coming back for that ration. And it also allows monitoring of herd health. So it can monitor temperature. It can monitor how long the animal's on its feet. It can monitor even to some degree the disease that the animal might have. And obviously temperature is closely related to that. A second benefit is environmental impact. And the smart devices allow for reduced use of pesticides and herbicides. And I think we would all say the less we can use chemicals, particularly synthetic chemicals in the environment, the better that is for a variety of reasons. One, from an environmental protection perspective, but two, from a farmer perspective, because these chemicals often cost a lot. And so to the extent that we use the right amount at the right time in the right place, that is advantageous for agriculture. And the same thing applies to fertilizer. The soil is already nutrient rich, and the smart device already has information to allow us to know that. It will prevent fertilizer from being put in that place. But if the soil isn't nutrient rich, then it'll allow fertilizer to be placed and will tell us the right amount of fertilizer to make sure that we get optimal growth of that plant, whether it's corn, soybeans, canola, you name it. And then from a third point is the enhanced long-term sustainability. And we already alluded to this in terms of the dairy farmer, but reduced dependence on manual labor. And it's probably not that long from now where we're going to have farm equipment that will require no human to actually sit in the cab. And in some cases, that's already happening. And much like autonomous car driving in various places around the United States and Canada, we'll see the autonomous use of farm implements. And the smart devices allow the implement to be driven in the right place, again, at the right time. And it also allows the farmer, and we're seeing this, and we actually have a slide to talk a little bit about this in a moment, is there's more of a real focus on farm management as opposed to being out in that cab of that combine or the cab of that planter or tractor. And so the farmer can really put their expertise to use where it needs to be put. So let's move on to the next slide. And for those of you who are not familiar with farm implements, and I'll just do a quick review of that. And I've already talked about some of it, but certainly farm tractors. And I think most of you would know what that looks like, and certainly planters. And you can see one on the screen right above. And some of these are getting out to be just huge pieces of equipment, to the point that as a lawyer and as a government regulator, I've had to work a lot on what we call implements of husbandry regulation, which is how big can the farm implements be to safely drive down the road and not knock over a utility pole. And so that has become a preoccupation of those of us who've been in and out of government. Certainly crop sprayers, I've already talked about herbicides and pesticides, combines for the harvesting, and you'll see a lot of harvesting going on right now. If you're like me, you follow a lot of combines on the way into and out of work as they're on the various farm roads. I've already talked about robotic milkers, and then again, the livestock ear tags. And that's kind of a combination with robotic milkers, but where ear tags are fixed to the ear of the cow. And with the smart devices in there, they can actually monitor the animal's health. And that's become much more common, again, just within the last 5, maybe 6 years. And it's been a real labor saver, not only for farmers, but almost as importantly, the accuracy of the data is so much better than, once again, when you have humans collecting that data, because in many cases, there can be mistakes in the collecting that data by humans, where we don't see that nearly as much with smart devices. Going on to the next slide. So what types of data is collected? Well, as you can certainly imagine, weather and climate data. And so this data gets collected by smart devices. So when that planter, or whether that tractor is out there applying pesticides, herbicides, the smart devices can tell in part what the wind speed is, because when you're spraying, that's really, really important to know, because if you're spraying above a certain wind speed, that can actually be a regulatory violation, but also you want your chemical to go into the ground, not to go into the air and not to end up on someone else's field, particularly to the extent that that farmer might be an organic farmer. And by pesticides or herbicides crossing over in their farm, you've just destroyed their ability to be an organic producer. Land use data, so it can map out farmland to just an incredibly deep detail. So you can just think in terms of centimeters of a farm field, and it can figure out what the elevation is of that land, what the nutrients of that land, what the watering, or what the, how much moisture is in that soil. So is it a good time to plant or not a good time to plant? And what it's doing is coordinating with other data collected by government agencies, collected by third parties on what types of environmental conditions are going on at the time. And so you can combine that land use data with the environmental data, and that makes for much better decision-making in most cases, if not all cases. I've talked about the animal and animal production data, crop and crop production data. I've talked about the seeding, the use of herbicides and pesticides, but a lot of these smart devices are in drones now. And so instead of a person going out in the field and observing what type of plant pests might be happening or where there might be droughty conditions in some part of a field where irrigation might be needed, for example, now the drones are collecting this data. They're doing it through photography in many cases. And that's artificial intelligence is being used to determine what is the condition of that crop. And probably why I'm so interested in this back, I hate to say how many years ago, my most favorite job, not that I haven't had other great jobs, but when I was a college student, I was a senior and I was getting a concentration in science, technology, and public policy. I had the opportunity to work as an intern for our state pollution control agency. And my job during the summer was to fly around Minnesota in a float plane with a staff biologist, land on Minnesota lakes and take water samples. And at the time we were doing that, a satellite was going overhead taking pictures of us. And from the data we were collecting on Minnesota's 10,000 plus lakes, it's actually, I think, 15,683 lakes. As we were collecting this data through our physical labor on these lakes, the satellite was trying to, in a very, very simplistic kind of way, determine what the water quality might look like or be based on the appearance of that lake at the time we're taking that. And really that's what was going on now, but to a much, much more robust level. And so now you've got all this data that's being collected in the ground, in the air, being beamed up to satellites, being sent to aggregators. And I'll talk more about that again in a moment, but the information is being pulled together and it's a much richer database than for making decisions. I've already talked about soil information, and those the drones are particularly important again for weed and plant pest information, because again, it's so much more efficient for a drone to go across a large field. And in Saskatchewan, for example, the field can be thousands of acres if they're contiguous. And so a drone can do that so much more easily than a human can do that by driving around in a pickup truck. And certainly in British Columbia, the same is true as well. Next slide. So let's talk a moment then about how this value is being created. So first of all, there's individual data. We call that small data, and that data is being collected and it's of particular use and value to that farmer because it's data about that farm and it's important to that farmer so that they can make better decisions on how to be a farmer, essentially, to be engaged in agricultural production. And so that is of great value. We can talk a little bit later about the response we've got from interviewing farmers, principally in Saskatchewan, but in some other provinces as well, as to whether or not they feel at this point in time they're getting that value. I will say there is some debate among farmers about that. But the real value beyond the farm level value is the aggregated data, or what's known as big data. And that's something that Professor Pigeon is going to talk more about in a moment. But this data, and I've already alluded to this, is collected, and artificial intelligence, a system of algorithms are used to take this data and to achieve data solutions that humans either would be really slow to do or couldn't possibly see the connections, but artificial intelligence is able to do that. And some of it's through what's known as machine learning. And I'm not going to go through all these in great detail, but I just want to make you familiar with these terms. And so the machine learning is, again, as this data is brought in, there's different types of machine learning that's applied to achieve different solutions, conclusions that, again, are either provided to the farmer or provided to a third party. It could be the pesticide, herbicide company, whomever. Statistical analysis, probably don't need to describe that because it's fairly self-descriptive, but it's going through all the statistics that are gathered through smart devices and analyzing that data. And again, not using the human mind, although to some degree the human mind is used, but a lot of it's done through, again, artificial intelligence and machine learning. GIS, looking at where the farm field, that little part, those few centimeters in that farm field happen to be, and mapping out the soil conditions on that farm field. Computer vision analysis, I won't get into great detail, and I'm not really the expert on this. I know the others who are, but it's taking information that in the past, again, was gathered by humans, but the humans would, we as humans would try to come to some conclusions about that data. For example, take a road. And my background in part is in disaster preparedness and response. And I would know, I could take a map, and now of course it's electronic, but not too long ago it was a paper map, and I could figure out the location where roads are. And let's say that you're having a wildfire, and of course British Columbia has experienced that to a great degree this last summer into early fall. And what GIS allows me to do is know in advance where the roads are and know where that fire is going, so I can make decisions as an emergency response manager in almost real time. Whereas before I couldn't do that in real time because I have so much more data. It's being inputted on a map, an electronic map, and I can see, I can locate exactly where that is. Well, computer vision analysis is really trying to develop the intelligence within machine learning of where that road is and what that road should look like, where the buildings are, what they should look like. And that's kind of the pre-development. The image processing is more of the post-development. So what happens there is we can look at we can look at a photograph and we might pick out some of the buildings, but a machine through artificial intelligence and algorithms can actually figure out where every building is, what the building is used for, because it's already learned all of that. And so it can do it much, much more rapidly than we can as humans, and give us information so much more rapidly. And then, of course, there's reflective and surface temperature calculations. And I've already talked a little bit about that from the job that I had so many, many years ago, taking that satellite data and drawing conclusions from that as just one example. My last slide before I turn it over to Marc-André is just talking about small data. Again, that is at the farm level. And so when you hear that term, it's farm level data. Again, it's of value to producers, to farmers, and it's viewed by the farmer through software. It can be on their cell phone, it can be on their iPad, it can be on other devices. And there are ways then for the farmer to access that information so that they get the information on their own farm. And then it's typically third-party vendors that provide them with the value of the aggregated data. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Marc-André, and he's going to start talking about big data in agriculture. Thanks, everyone, for your attention.
Great, thank you, Bill. So before I jump into my part of the presentation, just a bit of background on me and where my interests kind of intersect with this project. As was noted, Michelle noted earlier on, I was not born on a farm, did not grow up around farms. I grew up in forest country in the northern and the Cambrian Shield of northern Ontario. So it's a bit distant from my day-to-day concerns, but I did work, as Bill alluded to, in the credit union sector for many years, and big data, that idea of big data that we're going to talk about next, was pervasive there. This has been an issue in banking now for probably 20 years. People have been thinking about this. And in fact, the policy agenda, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, is really shaping how that's going to play out. Who owns, controls, can use, has access to the data. Those questions are being dealt with in the banking sector first, but what happens there is going to play out in agriculture and all other domains of our lives. So that's where I kind of come at this issue from. I have a lot of experience on that policy question and the big data question from the credit union space, but I think it has a lot of applicability in agriculture. So what do we mean by big data? And Bill's kind of really already captured this. It's created when agricultural technology providers, and we use a nice handy acronym ATP to capture those folks. When you combine data from many farmers, so there's that element of big data where you're pulling together data from many farmers and you can tell interesting stories that way. But also when you kind of blend it with other data, and Bill gave a great example of him doing the water sampling, and then you've got the satellite data, and you're correlating those data. You're seeing, well, how do they work together? So those are the kinds of things you can do with big data that you can't do with that kind of small data. You can tell more general stories. You can learn from other farmers. It's a really powerful tool analytically. In banking, this is a powerful tool for risk assessment. You know, is Bill a good loan risk? Well, I can look at people just like Bill and say, oh yeah, he is. I can offer him a loan without worrying too much about his ability to repay. The same kind of logic can play out in agriculture by learning from other farmers who have circumstances similar to yours. You can kind of project the outcomes of a change in behavior. So that's the big payoff. And it's really important to kind of keep that in mind. But also this question that I'm going to keep coming back to is who owns, who controls, who has use, who can sell the data that's being collected on your farm. That's the crux of the policy issue. It's the crux of our study, in fact. So there's some big challenges with big data, and I'm just going to rhyme them off and I'll go into them in a little more detail. There's questions around trust. There's questions around competition and market power. And then there's questions around transformation of work. I might spend a little less time on that, but these first two are really, really important for thinking about these questions of ownership, control, access, and use. And like I say, what we're talking about today with agriculture is playing out and will be landing on your door. You're going to start seeing this stuff landing on your door through your banking relationships, but it's going to also start moving into the ag space. In fact, it's already there. So what do we mean by, what's the issue with trust? The trust here is that farmers generally, and Bill alluded to the fact that we had some conversations with farmers here in Saskatchewan, but also in other provinces. There's not a lot of confidence and understanding of what data are being collected. So Bill gave you some really good kind of snapshots of what is out there and what's happening. But what we found through our conversations is people don't really know. Farmers don't really know. They don't really know what's being collected. They're not sure how it's being used. They don't know anything about the ownership of the data. Some of this is maybe in their contractual terms, but they probably haven't opened up those documents and read them in any great detail. So there's this kind of general insouciance, I could say in French, there's just a certain degree of not knowing. And then coming alongside that uncertainty or that lack of knowing is a question of trust. We have a little bit segment of our report that talks about this Farm Credit Canada survey that found that 25% of surveyed farmers are less and less comfortable sharing their data in the last couple of years. If you look in Europe, you see similar kinds of concerns around trust. And at the root of this is a concern that the people who are collecting these data might be using them to kind of take advantage of farmers in a sense. So you combine this like lack of understanding about what's actually being collected, how it's being used, and this kind of breeds a natural fear about potential abuse of power. And that fear is not entirely misplaced. Bill alluded to one of our co-authors, Murray Fulton. Murray's written extensively. He's an ag economist and a co-op specialist. He's written a lot about the nature of agricultural industry, the sector, and it tends to be characterized by concentration. And it tends to be a concentrated industry because of economies of scale and scope. Things get cheaper and more efficient as you get bigger and you start doing more things. That's the basic premise. And so the same processes that characterize agriculture generally, who controls seed, who controls fertilizers, who controls farm equipment manufacturing or supplies, that tendency to concentrate in those sectors we're seeing evidence that that's happening in the data space as well. So then you get into the same types of issues. Is it these big entities have power over farmers? With that power, they have market power. They can capture a greater share of farmer profit. And so this is the long history of agricultural sector. It's part of the reason cooperatives reform is to kind of have a more balance of power in negotiations, and whether it's a kind of producer marketing cooperative in terms of selling and buying and selling farm products, or it's a supply cooperative to buy inputs. This has been historically the traditional response of farmers to this kind of fact of the business, which is that concentration thing. There's a related risk, and we don't talk a lot about this in our report, but Bill can give you a long story about this, a long and interesting story about the fact that you get this increasing concentration of power also creates questions around foreign control and ownership. So if you have 2 or 3 firms that own, all the data that's being collected from farm implements, right? And then some foreign entity buys that firm or takes control of it through shareholding purchases. Then suddenly you may be raising concerns about national security. What can they do with that farm data that is against the interests of the country, not just the farmers, but the nation itself? So these are kind of some of the issues that arise when you start thinking about data ownership, like we've traditionally thought about other forms of ownership in agriculture. So that's a concern. So you pair that with the farm trust issue, and you've got a soup here. You've got a bit of a messy soup. There's also the nature of farming that's changing, and I think Bill alluded to this as well. Farmers are becoming increasingly managers, and I think Bill can speak to this much more authoritatively than I can. But this is what the research suggests. And as they become more managerial, they also become reliant on the agricultural technology providers. They're reliant on their machines, of course, but they're also reliant on the data and the analytics, all those analytical strategies that Bill's talked about. The farmer becomes reliant on them, on their implement manufacturers to give them that information. And so the relationship between the farmer and the implement, or the ATP, the agricultural technology provider, starts to shift. It's really the balance of power is shifting, not just because these organizations own a lot of data, but they're making meaning from the data, and the farmers are becoming increasingly reliant on that meaning to do their job. And so you start seeing farmers, the risk is you start to see farmers becoming more managers and less owners. And that's kind of where we're getting at with this point. And then the farm workers, and I think Bill alluded to this as well, become increasingly unskilled. There's less need for that skilled farmer who just understood how to do things because the data is telling the manager what to do. So that's the changing nature of farming, and this all flows from this kind of data ownership and data concentration issue. So how have people met these challenges? And part of our research was to kind of scan the globe, frankly, to see what people were doing. And the thing that emerged most prominently, at least in the ag sector, was the emergence of voluntary agreements. And so I'll talk about that in a minute. But there's also a public policy response, and I alluded to this in the banking space. But that banking story is just a small wedge of a much larger story about data charters, data ownership, data control that is very much on the policy agenda in Canada, in the European Union, in the United States, Australia, New Zealand. Everywhere, every major jurisdiction, agricultural jurisdiction in the country is wrestling with this question of data and through a public policy response. And then the third response, and this is more of a hypothetical one, but an important one, and that's the potential for cooperatives to be a way of addressing the market power issue, the trust issue, and even the farm working relationship issue, right? That relationship of a manager versus an owner. So we're going to I'm going to dig down into each of these a little bit more in the next part of this talk. So what do we mean by voluntary codes? Let's look at one here, and Bill knows this one intimately, so he'll be handling the questions on this if there are any. The American Farm Bureau Federation back in 2014 put together a voluntary code around data that's collected from your implements. And the way this works right now is an agricultural technology provider, that's ATP. They will submit a sample contract and answer 11 questions that flow from this voluntary code. This is the first part of the process. Their objective, the ATP's objective, hopefully, is to get a certification seal. And the certification seal will tell farmers that, hey, you can trust these guys. They're not going to use and abuse your data. They're going to treat you with some respect in terms of the data ownership and control issue. And so the process begins with the agricultural technology provider submitting a sample contract, answering these 11 questions. And then that submission, if you want to think of it that way, is evaluated by a law firm that is contracted through a special purpose entity that was created by the AFBF and its partners around this voluntary code. So there's this kind of this vetting process. It's a seal. You need to get through this hoop to get the certification, to get the seal. And when you do, you get this, like I say, you get this certification award. And so far, according to the data, I think Bill was gathering these, there's 37 companies have agreed to follow the core principles. 26 have actually been certified and can use the seal. Now, of the ones we looked at, this, I hope I'm not mistaken in saying this, Bill, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the most rigorous one. This is the most rigorous one. We see other codes playing out in other jurisdictions that are less robust, a little more, little less vetting, a little more self-reporting. And so that's what we're seeing elsewhere. So New Zealand, for example, there's a voluntary code there. It's a self-certification process. In Australia, there's a voluntary code there. There's no certification process. And same in the EU, you've got some kind of similar type of arrangement, but not really anchored in this kind of evaluation process. But I think the point we want to get across here with this kind of very quick overview of these codes is that you've noticed maybe perhaps that I haven't mentioned that there's a code in Canada, and that's because there isn't. Canada does not have a code. Canadian farmers are behind in a sense on this issue. We haven't even had, to our knowledge, those conversations haven't even started, whereas they're well along in other countries. And 2014 seems to be that point where a lot of those conversations started happening or generating kind of results in terms of voluntary codes. So that's the kind of main takeaway from this kind of voluntary code approach. They're happening, but not in Canada. And the important thing to kind of emphasize, I think, about these codes is that they provide the farmers a beginning of understanding about the issues here. So I've kind of addressed some of the common themes here. So there's questions of, and I've already said these things a few times, ownership, access, control, security, liability, and transparency and portability. These are the kind of themes that are typically addressed in these farm codes. But the other important thing that we maybe didn't give quite enough emphasis to in our report, but I think is absolutely fundamental, is that it starts to get farmers comfortable with the idea that data is really important for the future of their business, for the future of their farm, and to get ready for this policy train that's left the station. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about next in just a minute. But that's the other really important, I think, benefit of these voluntary codes is that it starts to culture farmers into thinking about data as another input, just like they've long thought about seed and fertilizer and other inputs. And once you start thinking about that way and you start recognizing just how fundamental it is for your business, then you can start seeing the power that's being vested in the firms that own these data now. And you can start seeing the need for these voluntary codes and to pay attention to the policy agenda. So there's some benefits, I've kind of alluded to this in the last few minutes, around these voluntary codes. I've given you the sense that they're important for preparing farmers to think about these things, but they're also good to build trust, of course, right? So that's, as you start to understand and kind of take down those walls of uncertainty, this helps you feel more confident about how your data is going to be handled and kept and stored and analyzed and so on. These voluntary codes also, I use this term, economize on the learning process. If a farmer negotiating with or thinking about buying an implement of some kind, if they can look for that seal, assuming it's kind of certified in some way, that saves them cognitive load. They have to do all the research. They can have some confidence that their organizations, their farm organizations, have done the vetting and have said, you know what, you're probably okay with these guys. Don't be too worried about buying their stuff, right? So that's the That's the other benefit. And then the last one is the one I've just flagged. So that's in the voluntary code thing. And again, the point I think I want to emphasize is not only is this beneficial in terms of, buying things, but it's also beneficial in terms of getting ready for the policy agenda that's coming your way. And let's talk a bit about that policy agenda. On the policy agenda, there's three big issues that are that emerge for policymakers when they're thinking about data and big data, whether it be with farmers, banks, credit unions, or just humans, individuals. And the things they think about are privacy. So, can I retain some privacy despite all this data that's collected on me through my many interactions? Is my data portable? Can I take my data, and I'll use an example outside the world of farming, but can I take my data from Facebook, for example, and port it over to some other platform that I think is better? Maybe it fits my needs better. Maybe it's politically more aligned with what I believe. But this idea of portability is really important, and it's really hard to do right now. If you have any experience with big social media platforms and you've tried to move your data, your contacts, your history, your timelines, any of those things, it's almost impossible. And that's purpose. That's on purpose. Those social media entities are making it hard for you to leave, so you can be captive and they have more eyeballs to sell to advertisers. The same thing is true in farming. The more your data gets aggregated in one or two places, the more difficult those one or two places are going to make it for you to move your data. And policymakers are very sensitive to this. And so they're starting to build in, they're starting to devise policies that will enshrine a data portability right. Now, when you talk about data portability, there's two elements that go into that. And these are really important. They relate back to what Bill was saying. There's the data that you as a farmer or as an individual have given. So if you were on Facebook, that could be, your birthday or your contacts or your wedding anniversary, whatever, right? So there's this kind of basic data that you're feeding into Facebook. But Facebook does these value-added services. They'll take the data that you provided, they'll look at your timeline, and they'll have an algorithm, like the algorithms Bill talked about, that will take that data, provide some analysis, and feed it back to you and say, hey, Marc-André, did you know that your birthday happens to be the same birthday, date of birth as somebody famous? Or did you know that Bill over there in Wisconsin is celebrating his anniversary today? And so the platforms take the raw material and then they transform it. And that part of the data typically is not portable. It's even the legislative changes that are coming down the line tend to draw a line around what you provide and the value-added services that the firms add to what you provide. And so that's a really important policy dimension for farmers, because as we were saying earlier, farmers are increasingly being relegated to these, or will be increasingly relegated to these managerial roles, and they're going to be dependent on all that value added, and they won't necessarily have a legal right to go and get the value added data they've shared, that they depend on. So this is a really important principle of the policy discussion. And the other important principle is interoperability. This is it's a both complicated and simple idea. The simple idea is you probably are all familiar with interoperability. If you've ever repaired your own vehicle or maybe your tractor or whatever, and you've bought a non-OEM, non-original equipment manufacturer part, that's interoperability. You bought a disc brake from somebody other than GM, for example, and you put it on your car and it worked. That's interoperability. It's that ability to get parts and other services from not the original manufacturer and plug it in. The same idea plays out in data. I'll give you the example, the classic example, and then I'll ask you to think about what that would look like in agriculture. The classic example is Facebook and a little website called MySpace. I don't know if people remember MySpace, but it was like the early version of Facebook. It was very popular. Everyone thought this is the be all and end all of social media. And then along comes Facebook and they eat their lunch, right? They eat MySpace's lunch. How did they do that? One of the ways they did that was they plugged into MySpace. So you could be a user on Facebook and you could communicate with your network on MySpace and never have to leave the world of Facebook. So this is interoperability in the digital realm. In the farm realm, you can imagine if there was a rule around interoperability, you could have a big data aggregator, a big company that owns your data and many other people's data, And you could build an application that plugs in to that data. And if the rules were structured the right way, the big data aggregator wouldn't be able to say no. So MySpace couldn't tell Facebook, you can't do this. In the future world, if there was interoperability rules, you could build an app, your co-op could build an app to plug into those data and make some use of them independent of the data aggregator. So that's a third big public policy consideration. And some of this, all these things I'm talking about now, like I said, are going to land the next year or two in the banking space. It's a policy idea called open banking, and you will probably experience it directly very soon. So this is the policy train. It's left the station. Then you've got the voluntary codes, which are an important kind of tool to anticipate these policy changes. I'll just say one more quick thing about this. This stuff is already playing out in the European Union. It's called the GDPR. And in Australia, there's a data charter. In Canada, there's also a data charter that's on the docket. It got parked because of the election. But all these issues that I'm talking about now are going to be playing out through this Bill C11 in the next year or two in Canada. And they're really profound implications for the questions of data ownership and control for farmers. And then the last possible way to think about this data issue is from the data cooperative perspective. If you remember a moment ago, I was saying that I think the big conceptual break is for farmers to start thinking about data like the same way they think about other inputs. It can be a really important part of your business going forward. And once you start thinking about that way, and once you start recognizing that there's power in owning and controlling those data, then maybe you start thinking about, well, what was the traditional farmer solution to the power imbalance? It was cooperatives, right? Whether it's UFA, United Farmers of Alberta, you see this with the cooperative retailing system, the local retails, many in rural Western Canada provide farm inputs. That was the way you kind of leveled the playing field with the big guys. And so the thought here is that cooperatives, either new cooperatives or existing cooperatives like UFA, could be the people that the aggregation. They take control of the data. They manage it in the interests of the farmers who control and manage the cooperative. And so then you break down some of this inequity that seems endemic to agriculture, and you start thinking about these things differently. So that's kind of one of the big kind of conclusions from our report. The other thing I want to leave you with, and I'll stop here, is I thought it'd be helpful to think about some short-term, pragmatic, very short-term takeaways. So we don't have a voluntary code in Canada for farmers, but the first thing you can do as an individual farmer or as a small group of farmers is start understanding your data. If you're in a farm organization, who does what? Who has responsibility for data? Does your organization, has you kind of slotted that into the organizational chart? And I'll just say these 3 points that I'm going to talk about in a minute, or that I'm talking about now, I've pulled from my familiarity with the discussions that are happening in credit unions and banks. This stuff that I'm telling you here is what credit unions and banks are doing right now. This is how they're starting to think about these data issues. So they clarify responsibility. They start thinking about data architecture. It's a fancy word for just saying, how are you organizing your data? Are you creating responsibilities around the organization of data? And so there's this idea of a data stewardship group within your organization, or if you have a bigger farm, who can you put a little team together that has oversight over that? And then the third thing that I think is really important for farm organizations, maybe not so much for individual farmers, but for larger farm organizations, is to elevate this issue to the board and really start getting the board involved and seeing this as a strategic issue that needs some overarching policy and controls and oversight. So these are some, I hope, useful takeaways. And with that, I'm going to stop talking. And thank you for your kind attention. And I think Bill and I are happy to take questions now.
Thank you so much, Bill and Marc-André. That was very informative. I hope people here today have been able to see how this relates within their own contexts and potentially for the contexts of their members. For me personally, it really helped to demystify what data in agriculture is, and I appreciate the more concrete steps that could be taken, like at a very local level, to what to do in terms of board level practices. So yeah, we will open this up to question and answers. So folks can put up their hands or just unmic and share their question or put it into the chat. Oh, Warren, great. Thanks, Warren.
First of all, Bill and Marc-André, excellent presentation. I would actually see this as an emerging issue / opportunity, Bill, to use your word. I think my question, actually, it's twofold. One is, are there live examples today where big data is being used in agriculture that any organization that's looking at these opportunities could go and look at? Because I've worked in other industries where big data as a concept it's one of those big ideas, but it can be somewhat nebulous, and the value that gets created out of the investment, you get good information, but is it useful? Useful information that can then be monetized. So I'm just wondering if there's examples like that. And then secondly, are there funding opportunities that you're aware of that for organizations who potentially want to do some R&D in this area to actually go out and get some money to be able to invest behind?
Bill,
you want to take a first crack at that?
Yeah, well, those are great questions, Warren. And first of all, an example. I'll give you an example from the United States, although I know that UFA, FCL, other Canadian cooperatives are spending a considerable amount of time thinking about their data and how that can be put to better use for their member owners. But I'll give you an example from the United States. As some of you know, I serve on the national board for our farm credit system. Unlike Canada, in the United States, farm credit is a cooperative. And I'm on the board of the insurance and education arm of that. And it's a system that has 500,000 farmer owners across the country. And we have about $363 to $668 billion in assets, depending on the day. It varies, but it's a big number. It's to the point where we're now the third largest government-sponsored entity in the United States. And we have more data on farmers than anybody, and we believe that even includes the United States government at this point, because we're lending to the farmers that produce about 80% of the agricultural production in the United States. And as I said, we're a cooperative, we're a federated system. So we have a national. Now, I won't go through the description of the entire organization, but think of it as a pyramid. And as you go down the pyramid, you get closer and closer to that producer. And so I also serve on the board of Ag Country Farm Credit, which is headquartered in Fargo, North Dakota. We cover the eastern half of North Dakota, the western half of Minnesota, and the northern part of Wisconsin. So those 3 states. And we have been looking at our data over the last 4 years, and that's both at the staff and the board level, in a way that we've never looked at it before. And so we have so much data on our members. We know exactly what their financial situation is. We know the acreage that they farm, where they're farming it. We know what they're planning to plant 3 years from now. Who's going to provide them with the inputs. We know who they sell their production to. I mean, we just have such a wealth of data on them. And what we've said in our preliminary discussions is both from a national perspective and at more the local level, as we call it, the association level, is that we need to be not only collecting this data, but aggregating it for the benefit of our member owners. And when we talk about monetizing it, we're monetizing it from the perspective that we can provide better products and services to our owners, but that they'll have better data than which to judge the inputs that they're getting from others. Because right now they're really depending on that data from the pesticide salesperson, the herbicide salesperson, but this will allow us to actually look at efficacy from the farmer end. And this will be data owned by the farmer, because after all, we're a cooperative. And just in the last, I think, 3 years, we've hired 3 full-time data analysts in our association. We have about 700 employees, again, for the North Dakota, Wisconsin, Minnesota Association. Nationwide, we have way more than that. But those 3 data analysts are trying to figure out what data do we have, what can we use it for, and how can it benefit the member owner? And as part of that discussion, we're looking at, would we ever give this data to a third party? Because that's one way we could monetize this. I will say that there are companies that are actively trying to purchase this data from us. Perspective right now is that we only want to use this data for the benefit of our member owners, and by selling it to others, even though we get money for it, wouldn't necessarily benefit them in the same way. So this is a policy discussion we're having right now. And it's a really, really important policy decision because it's going to affect the vast majority of producers across the United States. We've had some initial discussions with Farm Credit Canada. Obviously, it's a Crown corporation, so it's a little bit different from an ownership perspective, but they're looking at this issue too, from what we understand. So those would be some examples, Warren, of where the data is being collected, where it's being aggregated, and the policy discussion is occurring over how do we monetize this and who benefits from this monetization. And so that's first. Second, from a funding opportunity, I'm not sure that I know a specific sources, but I know in the interviews that I did and others in the team did, not only producers, but in promotion councils, that there was great interest in this issue. And so I think there may be an opportunity, not just with Farm Credit Canada, but also with your various, whether it's the wheat growers or with the corn growers or the canola growers, whomever, that they may be very interested in partnering on this issue and providing some financial resources. And I know the reason why I say this is because in my discussions, they mentioned this possibility. And so I'll provide that as the second part of the answer to your question. Hopefully that was helpful.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I might just add a couple of quick points to this. I'm going to post a story that ran the Globe and Mail a little while ago. Murray actually glommed onto. It was about a company called Semios that's been buying up ag tech companies. And one of the key phrases in this story was that the person who's leading these purchases said clients have told them they're tired of dealing with multiple startups that help collect data and guide decisions on farm conditions. And they've encouraged him to buy other emerging players so they could deal with fewer suppliers, which is a bit of a funny story, but that's the story they're telling themselves. And they're going up and hoovering up all these farm tech companies. So, the big data issue is not just about, the use case, of course, that's important, but there's clearly things that are happening to concentrate and ownership in the sector. And so I think that's important to kind of recognize. And the other piece that I would add too is the policy train. In a sense, it's important, of course, that that these things be useful, but policymakers are convinced it's useful, and they're gonna be doing things that are gonna shape the way you make access these things. So it's an important point, but there's forces at work here that are coming at us one way or another, sort of thing.
Excellent, thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Darlene.
I'll just say thanks to Bill and Mark. That was very interesting. And I'm aware of a lot of what you were talking about, but from the perspectives that you've provided, it gives me a lot to think about from where I stand too. So I really appreciate the information you provided today.
Great, thanks. Thanks for
Thank you.
participating.
I just want to add something. I meant to throw this in the last answer. Warren asked about money, and one of the things we're talking about is actually applying for some yet more funding. But in this case, we're talking substantial money that would involve the potential to pilot something. So it wouldn't just be about research. It would be actually partnering with farm organizations to actually build something that could address some of the concerns that we've outlined here. So there is that effort that we're going to be undertaking in the next few months. That's very interesting. Oh, and we'd look for support from people on this call, of course, in that application. So maybe knocking on your door.
Yeah, and if I could, unless there's another question right at the moment, just talk another moment about the Farm Bureau Federation in the United States, the National Farm Bureau Federation, their voluntary principles that Marc-André talked about. And there's a number of organizations that have signed on to those voluntary principles, but a couple of the largest are cooperatives. And so I think that that should not be a surprise that the cooperatives are at the leading edge, at the spear point of this issue. There's also Monsanto, which of course is now owned by Bayer. And in fact, Bayer is thought now to own about 53% of the world's agricultural data. You can decide if that's good or bad, but that is what analysts say. And before Monsanto was purchased by Bayer, the chief information officer, chief technology officer from Monsanto said, we're not a pesticide, herbicide, and seed company. We're a data company. That's where the dollars are in this company. And that was really Bayer's interest in purchasing Monsanto, was to get access to that data. And you can decide whether or not it's a good idea that so much data is in so few hands. But as we've talked about, the cooperative form, or the cooperatives would be one way to ensure that it's not just in a few hands. Because my background, just a little bit more, is, and probably why I have my interest in this issue, is I served as the Deputy Commissioner of Agriculture for the state of Minnesota, to be akin to your deputy minister, and did that for almost 8 years. And then I was what you would consider the Minister of Consumer Protection for the state of Wisconsin, which actually was combined with our Department of Agriculture. And this is why I'm so interested in agricultural data: who owns it, who's using it, the security of that data, because there are implications, both good, many of which I talked about today, but there are potentially harmful implications. And is this an issue that we as a Canadian agricultural industry, and I'd like to include myself in that group if I may, because I've been doing work in Canada now for really about 15 years. And I will point out my mother's family's from Ontario. And should we be thinking about this issue now before really the monetization occurs outside of us, the control occurs outside of us, the security decisions are being made outside of us? And this is really the time for us to start thinking about this. And back to the Farm Bureau Federation. So as Marc-André said, in 2014, they came forward with voluntary principles. Those were, I think I'll use the term, mimicked by New Zealand and Australia, two other countries that have voluntary principles. The European Union looked closely at the Farm Bureau principles and then put overlay of privacy, which the European Union is particularly known for. But you look in the rest of the world and it's a blank slate, and Canada being one of the blankest slates on that. So that's why we've done this study. That's why we continue to do the study. And that's why we would like to talk to more and more people within agriculture in Canada to bring attention to this issue and say, what should we be doing in this case? Because I can tell you, just looking down the list of Farm Bureau Federation again, many of them are what I call investor-owned companies. And it's good that they've signed on to these voluntary principles, but the proof will be in the product as to whether these voluntary principles really make a difference for the benefit of producers.
Thanks, Bill. We have a question that came in through the chat. What has been the response to this issue from any government officials you have talked to thus far?
I think I'm going to let Bill handle that because I haven't been involved in those conversations. So Bill, over to you.
Yeah, so I've had discussions with policy, I guess you call them policy directors, mostly below the deputy minister level at a couple of provincial agricultural ministries at this point. This was mostly a new issue for them. They said they've touched it at the margins, but they are very, very interested in this, to the extent that we're going into this issue. And then tomorrow we actually have a meeting with the BC agriculture minister to talk about this and some other issues. And so we'll be directly talking about this with your own agriculture minister. And I think we all expect it's going to be a pretty rich discussion. BC has been on the leading edge of a number of issues. And we expect that this might be another issue that BC perhaps decides to take a lead on. And Michelle, you've had some discussions with the ministry, and so has Paul, and perhaps you could join in on this as well.
Yeah, we have had meetings with various Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries staff, and through that, navigating like who we should be speaking with around data in agriculture. There has been a connection made with a director in the ministry whose portfolio includes agritech, and seems to be most closely related to data in agriculture. I'm meeting with her on Friday. So like the conversations are moving, and we're definitely highlighting that this is an area of focus for BC Co-op Association, and are developing this symposium program in February to really have a deeper dive into it. So I'm not sure, Paul, if you wanted to jump in here and add anything. He may be.
Nothing to add. You've been the lead on all of this, and with Bill, a great presentation, and looking forward to the discussion with the minister tomorrow, and of course the conference in Kamloops. That not only we have these two fine gentlemen speaking, but a number of representatives from across the world. Maybe Michelle, you want to maybe describe that quickly? What's being planned there?
Sure. So we recently found out about the SHRC grant being successful. So the team is going to be meeting very soon to get the wheels moving on this. However, the topics that were outlined for the symposium include looking at alternative models and lessons learned, looking a bit more in detail into data cooperatives, looking at open data policies and role of government, as well as bringing producers into the conversation. And I think from today, that's really clear that the producers need to be part of the conversation and development of what is happening around the data. And there will also be a workshop component to the symposium, so that we're looking at concrete action items to start to bring some things into practice.